Thank you. Thank you. Great to be here. Nice to see such an eclectic mix. I moved around not just the UK, but also in different parts of the world. So I've been to one or two of your countries that visited. So I've worked in, my background is protected area management, working in a variety of national parks. I've also done some work over in Australasia and over in the States as well. So, but Cumbria brings me back. And this evening, I'm going to give you a bit of background to start with. So I'll give you a bit of flavour. You might not know about the National Trust, especially if you don't live in the UK. So a bit of flavour given our international students about the National Trust, what we're here to do, and then a bit about the World Heritage Site that we've just been given, which is fantastic. So a bit of understanding that. And then we're going to talk through some of the challenges we're facing in the Lake District, and then some of the solutions we're working through at the moment, and some of the really great practice. And so hopefully that will keep you entertained. Given the structure of that, I'll stop at a few places. So if you do have questions about particular elements, we can pick them up, and then we can have a general discussion at the end, which I think would be great. Okay, so I used the phrase a sort of national property. And Cumbria, in particular the Lake District, as Grace just said, is one of those places when you come here to work or as a student, you can't get away. It keeps coming back to you. It's got an amazing connection. So it's no coincidence that this national park has over 18 million visitors, and many of those are repeat visitors. And so it was interesting, Wordsworth, when he was writing about the place, he came up with this phrase, and it very much hangs for me. And today's presentation is going to be kind of around that idea of a national property. And so I'll explore that with you a bit later on. I kind of had my roots here as well, although I wasn't born here. I came here on holiday every year since the year dot to the same bed and breakfast in Keswick for 20 years and climbed my mountains and got bored when I was a teenager wanting to go where my friends were in a nice sunny climate, but it did come back to me. And now I'm really privileged to live back here in Cumbria, enjoying the landscape, and I managed to get out in the rare free time I have to run the fells in particular. So it is part of me, and I think it's very important from a leadership point of view that you have people in these kind of landscapes that are credible, understand the issues. We might not agree always on what the solutions are, but we have a real passion for that place. So the National Trust is an organisation that works across the UK with the largest conservation charity in Europe. In about 2 weeks' time, we're going to pass 5 million members. So people who join the organisation, a very large organisation. But the most interesting thing about National Trust, and I'll come on to the reason we were formed originally because it has its roots here, is that one of the unique things from these protected places is that we have, under our Act, we're covered by an Act of Parliament, and under that Act, when we purchase land or we're given land, it is held in what we call perpetuity. That means we can never sell it. It's held on behalf of the nation forever. So it can't have any development on it. It can't be sold off in any other way. So that's a really important conservation ideal that came through. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we go through the story of the World Heritage Site. But it's a really interesting one. It puts us in a very unique place. And it's actually triggered other countries throughout the world to think about that. And we now have a consortium called the International National Trust that has over 45 different member organisations that are charities in different parts of the world, many in some of your countries, for those of you who come from overseas, who have this. And this idea of how do you protect landscapes, cultural heritage, houses, things that are important to your nation. How do you not lose that history? So we were formed by 3 very forward-thinking people who came together with a united view that they wanted to look after the nation's heritage at a time of significant change. So we're in the late 1800s here when the Industrial Revolution was going full pelt. The lady on the left is, on your left? Yeah, your left is Octavia Hill. She was lived in London. She was really concerned about the poverty in London and the need to have green space and places where people could get away from that. The gentleman in the middle is a guy called Canon Rawnsley that at the time was living up here in the Lake District and spent most of his life up here. He had been a vicar over on the other side of the lake at Ray Castle, and he was taken by what was going on here at the time. In the Lake District, there was a fight going on. There was a fight about development, industrial revolution coming on here. They wanted to build reservoirs, they wanted to build railways, and he sat from his house in Grasmere overlooking Grasmere thinking, my gosh, this landscape is so special, we need to find a way of protecting this landscape from this development. And the guy on the right is Ian Hunter, who was also thinking about that from an academic point of view. And they came together and created this organisation called the National Trust. And it developed over time through different needs of society. And we have a history that's changed over time from different needs of society, from protecting post-Second World War country houses to public access around our coast to today's challenges. And we recognise the biggest challenges we have in this country today is around the decline of our natural environment and people's connection with that natural environment, and that's our strategy. If you want to find out more about the Trust, I've got some leaflets at the back for you to pick up. So we have some really significant holdings in the Lake District, and I'm just going to show you a short little film that will help you give you a bit of inspiration about the special places we have here. So yeah, just thought I'd give you a flavour of the variety of the things that we have in our care. Many of which we manage in partnership with our tenants, whether that be people that run the pubs for us or our farmers who manage the majority of our land here. So we own about a fifth of the national park here, and that actually makes up a fifth of the National Trust's total land ownership. So I recently, when I had our Director General up a few years ago, when I put her back on the train, I'll never forget, she turned to me and said, "They're the crown jewels, don't drop them." So I feel immensely privileged to be responsible for it. And that most of our ownership is around the central Fells area, the kind of heart of the Lake District, as you saw from the films. So these landscapes, you know, are the heart of what we own. But one of the interesting things I always like to talk to people about is, well, what does this landscape mean to you? Because depending on where you've come from, this landscape will mean different things to you. So, you know, is it a beautiful landscape? Is it a community at the edge of extinction? Is it an opportunity for a different type of landscape? Is it a landscape you want to protect? Is it a flood waiting to happen? Is it somewhere you come on holiday? Is it somewhere that you once came and you want to come back to. So, of course, it is many things to many different people. And one of the things that we found in the Lake District through much research that we've done is this essence of the Lake District having an emotional connection with people. Most people that come here have this deep emotional connection. It's maybe where they came on their holiday for the first time, maybe where they proposed to their wife or husband, or maybe where they scattered their parents' ashes. A lot of people have that deep emotional connection, and so they care about what happens here. And with that care and passion comes views on what it is. So it's often described as kind of a conflicted landscape because of all these ingredients that make it up. But what we know that it is a landscape of kind of timeless beauty, and one that without a doubt continues to need to be protected. And one of the ways we can do that is by having it as a national park. But I'm really proud to be part of the team that has achieved World Heritage Site designation for this landscape. It's been 25 years in debate whether the Lake District would be a World Heritage Site, and it will continue to be debated by many whether it's a good thing or not. We are now a World Heritage Site, and so I was just going to talk to you for a few minutes about what the World Heritage Site means, what it's been designated for. One thing it doesn't mean is a shed loads more protection. It's actually a badge. It's a badge of recognition, of global recognition of this landscape, alongside all those other amazing landscapes around the world. But it's interestingly, it's a landscape that's we've entered into to UNESCO as a cultural landscape. So they have many different definitions, and we've gone for cultural landscape, and that's why it took us 25 years. It was a long debate with UNESCO and the World Heritage Site Centre about what was the best thing for the Lake District. Was it around its natural beauty? Was it around how the landscape had developed with man and nature? And so we've ended up in this place of what's called cultural landscape, which is where the combined works of man and nature have come together to form this landscape, where the evolution of human settlement has developed over time, and a landscape shaped by people under the influence of the physical constraints and the opportunities that provides us. And this idea of this intertwinedness of man and nature, of which I'm sure you can think of other landscapes near you that might have that theme. But in the Lake District, it's this. There are two or three elements that I just want to go into a little bit more detail for you are. And first of all is this middle paragraph around this fusion of what we describe as communal agricultural pastoral systems. So this is the way the farming community have worked this land over generations, over the last few thousands of years. They've worked the land in a way that delivers what you see today. And they've adapted to the needs, which I'll talk about as well. And the way that landscape has developed has triggered people to think differently about landscape. And that has also led to the conservation movement. So we identified three kind of themes that the World Heritage Site would kind of hang under. The first one is this idea of identity, this place, this spectacular landscape shaped by people, as I said, through thousands of years, not just through farming, but through other things. So if you were living here 100 years ago, you would have seen a lot more mining going on in this landscape. It would have been a much more worked landscape, which we'll look at in a moment. So this idea that this landscape has a unique identity that's been shaped by man. The second one is this essence of inspiration, how this landscape has inspired people over over generations. But two particular bits of history we've kind of highlighted on. One is the idea is the period of the Romantic poets. So these are the Wordsworths, the Ruskins and others of the world who were thinking about landscape and writing around them. And their writing got global recognition for changing the way we perceive the landscape. And at the same time, people were thinking about how these landscapes looked in Victorian times. And we'd gone from a period of thinking these landscapes were dangerous, dark places to places that you could come and enjoy. The Lake District also has the unique place of having the first book written as tourist guide to the Lake District. Was one of the first ever tourist guides written in the world. So yeah, there's this idea of how this landscape has changed our thinking and understanding of landscape itself. And finally, this idea of protection and of conservation. And actually, the Lake District was the birthplace of not just the National Trust, but also of the National Park movement that developed the modern day conservation movement that we see happening throughout the world. And therefore, it's the recognition of that and the continued challenge that has. And of course that plays out in many ways around the Lake District. So it's not just about the beautiful natural landscape, it's about the amazing Victorian villas that you'll see around the Lake District, around Windermere in particular, many of unfortunately which are closed to the public, but many of which are hotels, some of which are visitor tourist destinations. It's about the rock, the walls, the field systems that you see, which you'll be seeing tomorrow if you haven't seen as you go around, and about the mining history, and also about the settlements that have developed over time. So, and it's that combination of factors that brings it all together. But I guess what's unique about the Lake District, you can't really describe it as a whole. It's really hard to describe because each valley has its own uniqueness. And what the World Heritage Site has allowed us to do is understand the significance of each one of those valleys and not try and describe it all. So we've split the Lake District into what we call the words of valleys. So the way he described the valleys we've used as the backdrop to the World Heritage Site proposals. And we've then described the significance of each one of those valleys. So we're really clear through a changing landscape what are the things that we don't want to lose during that change. And so here we have Coniston Valley, looking down Coniston Water, and you can start to get the sense of the things that you pull out of that landscape. On the top, the farming, the yew tree farm, which is one of the iconic farms that Trust has, the designed picturesque landscape at Tarn Howes, which many of you are going tomorrow on your field trip, the Victorian villa at Monk Coniston, the Herdwick sheep that graze this land are part of that farming system that is so important to here that we need to retain, and the mines that have been here from the past hand of man. So you get to start to see how this picture, this mosaic of features comes through. And it's really important for us to understand how and what that means in different places as we move forward. So what does that mean in terms of how we manage this place? So I'm also lucky enough to work within a really dynamic partnership. So it's quite complicated up here. There's a lot of players who want to have a view. And we're lucky that we've developed a very strong national park partnership, who are all the organisations that are involved in land management, in communities, in business, have all come together and said, actually, we want to collaborate. We want to work together in this landscape and drive it forward. And so we've written the plan. The World Heritage Site is also the National Park Management Plan, which also is unique. It's the only national park in the UK, I think in the world, that has that World Heritage Site and national park together. We have one plan rather than two. And all the organisations are signed up to delivering elements of that plan, which gives us strength as well. And at the heart of that plan is this essence of the vision of an inspirational example of sustainable development in action. Yeah, I'm sure you've probably read that in many documents. It's one of those catchphrases, but really, really think it's very important here because we're dealing with the different pressures. This idea of how we continue to retain this wonderful, spectacular landscape, the prosperous economy that underpins it. Without the prosperous economy, this landscape won't be able to be funded and managed. The essence of a world-class visitor experience that attracts the many visitors that allow this place to function, and also this essence of vibrant communities, which is a real challenge for us in an urbanised country where most of our policies are directed by urban city life. Rural life and the conversations around the future of rural communities is high in mind of the Lake District, whether that be access to broadband through to access to facilities like your local post office or doctor's surgery. So all those issues come out to play and we debate them as a partnership, and it's a very rich experience. But at the heart of that is a series of challenges. So within the management plan of the national park, and a lot of our conversations, is this essence of the challenges that we face, and we need to recognise those. And they're described in the document as risks, but I'm going to talk to you now a little bit about the challenges we face here in the Lake District, which taken as a whole can be quite of a, whoa, that's a lot of stuff to think about. But I think they're quite similar to many, well, I know they're very similar to many places around the world. And at the heart of this is this essence of change. Our catchphrase for the World Heritage Site was called the evolving masterpiece, which kind of sums it up. This is an amazing, not the saying it's an oil painting, it's certainly not an oil painting. We don't want to preserve this place like an oil painting. That is not the idea. The idea is that it is a masterpiece shaped by man, but it needs to continue to evolve. And I'd like to make the case that change is inevitable, but also essential to refuel the landscape and the communities that live here and the visitors that come here. And the way I was trying to get my head around it and talking to my staff, I came up with the idea of this the essence of seeing the Lake District like a chapter, like a very large book, a very large, I don't know whether it's trilogies or however you want to describe it, but imagine it like a very large book with a series of chapters. And I've described to you some of those key chapters. The Victorian times was definitely a key chapter, and we've just been going through a different chapter. And I believe we're at a point where we're turning the page for the next chapter of the history of the Lake District. So the conversation at the moment is, how much do we want to narrate the next chapter? How much do we just want to let it go chance? Or do we actually want to face into the future of the Lake District and start to talk about how the next chapter might play out? And I'm definitely in that latter place. I want to have that conversation about what that looks like. Some of the previous chapters are shown on the screen here, and these are probably previous chapters from the last 100 years, no more than that. So what I'm trying to talk to you about here is this landscape is not held in time. The top right one here is probably what most people would describe if you asked them to describe the Lake District to you. They'd probably describe this pastoral landscape with fields, with hills coming out of it, with bits of woodland. That's how most people see it. But in fact, the one on the top left is how it was more 100 years ago, and there's still evidence of that, a very industrial landscape that's mined. We have an amazing, rich mining heritage. This is Goldscope copper mine up in Durham. And so that mined landscape is still here. So the farmers that were farming that landscape in the turn of the 18th and into the 19th century and into the 20th century were also miners as well as farmers. But if you peel back a chapter further, they were working the woods. They were working the woods and that fed the industrial mills of the area. And so there was this idea of the woodlands being much more active. And the bottom right-hand corner is when this landscape, what the nation needed from this landscape was water. Manchester was growing as a city during the Industrial Revolution, and where do we get our water from? Where does it rain the most? Here. It rains the most here in the Lake District, as you probably already discovered in for those of you who recently visited our students from overseas. So yeah, so what happened was that that was a period of reservoir curation and damming of a couple of our valleys. So this landscape continues to change. The last 30 years has been a landscape that's been very much dominated by a farming need by the nation. Post First World War, Second World War, the need to feed the nation, the need to really drive that. And so we've been the strongest management over the last 30 years has been this one of hill farming, and which has been supported by subsidy payment from our taxpayers from Europe to help support it, because farming here is very marginal. It's not something you make a load of money for from the product, the meat that comes on it. And so that is in big debate, and I'll come back to it in a moment, but it's very much the last period of history. So that's kind of where we've got to, if that makes sense. We're in 2017, and we face now some significant challenges. Those are the challenges that we face, and we face some other challenges that we're also dealing with. And the one that's highest in mind at the moment is, hopefully you're aware of, is we've decided in the UK to depart from Europe. It's called Brexit, and with that means that we need to remove ourselves from a lot of the funding mechanisms that were in place. And in the Lake District I've just described, the hill farming system here is underpinned by European funding, and that is going to disappear. So there is a real threat around that. There's also a threat about where we can actually send our goods to be sold, because we have strong relationships with Europe. The trade deal is as important as the subsidy that we have here. So what will that mean for the Lake District? It could be catastrophe for how these places have been. It could be a wonderful opportunity to restructure how we pay for this and deliver the better outcomes that we've had over the last 30 years. The future of farming is very much at the heart of our mind, and you know, so the other things we're discussing and is a big debate area for us is the future of the next generation of farmers. So the trust we have 95 farms, which is about 2/3 of the hill farms in the Lake District, and we've got an ageing population. The average age of a hill farmer is around about 58, 60. So they're very much an ageing populace, and we're not seeing the next generation of farmers necessarily coming in everywhere. So we've got this real concern around the future of who is going to manage this landscape, especially if it's not a very profitable business. You might want to go and do something else with your time if you're a young folk. Alongside that is this retention of skill. There is an amazing amount of skill that's recognised in the World Heritage Site that is needed to manage this landscape, whether it be the dry stone walls and the skills associated with that to the skills associated with farming. And then there's also the conversations about what we need, what animal we need to graze this fell. So you'll see there's this sheep called the Herdwick, which the Lake District is famous for. That sheep works brilliantly up here for its ability to graze this landscape, to live up on the mountains, unlike other fells. It's actually Norse, it's Norwegian from its original, well, Scandinavian from its original time. It came over with the Scandinavian settlers and has stayed here ever since. So all these things are up for debate, and one of the things that we're doing a lot of is discussing that with our farming community about what the future holds. One of the other challenges we have that is high of mind for many people in the world is flooding. So in Cumbria, as you may well be aware, we've been hit by 3 major floods over the last 10 years, the last one in 2015, almost 2 years ago in December. And it created significant upheaval. And it's kind of got to a stage where we can't continue to deal with it. And I'll come on to that in a few minutes to talk about what we're going to do going forward. You can see the slide at the top. Sorry, this one, I don't know why this has dropped in. This was meant to drop in afterwards, the one in the front. But actually, that isn't a lake. They're 2 separate lakes with a town in the middle. That's up in Keswick that kind of morphed into one. One of the interesting things for you to reflect on that slide is where that water's come from. So it's come from the fells, come into the lakes, flooded the towns, and has come out the other end. And so there's a big debate going on about that. We're also seeing a series of the natural environment in decline. So some of the key species that we have in the UK are in significant decline, and in the Lake District and in the uplands in particular, we're seeing that. In particular, but this is an indicator of birds. I could show you lots of different ones, but this indication of the natural environment in decline is a big issue for us in the UK that we're having to deal with and try and reverse. And the last couple of kind of doom and gloom slides, and then I'll move into a space of happiness and it's all really okay, is tourism pressures. So when we announced World Heritage Site, all the conversation was about this. Rightly so. Actually, you got World Heritage Site, you've already got 18 million visitors, you don't want to need another 10 million, do you? We're full. You come here in August, we're full. The World Heritage Site is something different. It's about attracting a different type of a cultural visitor who we hope will stay longer and spend more. And our marketing will target it at that. But we do need to recognise that we've got a significant issue and continue to have a significant issue around congestion and the amount of people coming into this amazing landscape and what we're going to do about it. And that doesn't play out in the roads. It plays out if you walk on the fells. So you can see it pretty well here, whether it being the summit or the paths, this network of paths, you can see them. Those aren't walls, they're eroding paths. You can see through the fells there. So the landscape is under pressure. And we also have a cultural heritage here that isn't necessarily in fine fettle everywhere, especially the built environment. We have a lot of barns, a lot of historical legacy that we have to look after. And there's not a huge amount of funding for that now. There used to be a lot more funding. So there's a big discussion about how do we continue to maintain these features of this landscape and look after them for future generations when funding is very restricted. So hopefully that's given you a flavour for some of the challenges that we're facing and some of the issues that we've talked through. And at the last one, sorry, I can't believe I forgot it. The last one is the debate about who is right. It's quite a polarised debate up here. So we have different people on different sides of the community. We have commentators who describe the World Heritage Site as a complete disaster from a natural environment point of view, that this landscape is going to be held in aspect, it's going to be held as it is. And we have those on the other side saying, so for instance, National Trust, where we've been trying to do some different things and start to explore different ways of managing this land, we're being told that that's negative because we're putting at threat the future of farming. It's a very polarised conversation, and when you're in the middle of it, it can be very difficult at trying to find a way forward. There is hope. There is hope. So I'm just going to talk to you for the last 10 minutes about the different things that we're exploring. So we're of the belief, the National Trust, that the decline in the natural environment is something that we need to do, but there is hope. And we think if we put nature at the heart of our decision making, that will reap rewards more. So we need to think more around the natural processes and nature. So, you know, actually, if the condition of your soils, if you're losing your soils at the pace that we're losing the soils, and the quality of the soils is of such poor quality, we are not going to be able to grow the crops to support the stock. The landscape won't be able to be resilient to the change from the climate, and we're not going to get the rich wildlife that this landscape needs to look after and protect for future generations to inspire them. So there's a whole series of issues that we believe that we need to put nature higher up the agenda than it's been over the last few years, and allow natural processes to take place. So as a human being, we like to seem to fight nature, whether it's to make our rivers flow through our farming land quickly to get through so they don't flood it, through to stopping woodland spreading across where it wants to go, through to grazing our land too much so the natural flora doesn't come through. We are standing in the way of some of the natural processes that could help us find a solution. And I guess the flooding kind of brought that to mind, about actually that battle that we have with nature, and actually it's not one we're ever going to win, I don't think. So putting nature and natural processes at the heart of it is something we're starting to do, and we've got some really great examples out there. Over in Innerdale is an example that's used, a valley over in the west of the Lake District, where they're taking that approach. And so, for instance, in the last storm, Innerdale, the colour and of the water and the speed of the water coming through that valley, where they've allowed the river to find its own natural way, the impact it had on that valley was very different to the impact it had over on one of the other valleys in the Central Fells. So we're starting to see those indications where nature is giving more space, that it's actually responding in a really good way. This nature-culture debate that I mentioned just now, this tension that is here around doing more for nature but not losing the cultural aspects that make up the Lake District, the farmed landscape, the hand of man that you see, and making sure that that isn't lost. We believe it isn't helpful, actually. We believe that nature and culture are two sides of the same coin. They're about the same thing, really, and we just need to recognise that more, that they can't work with one without another in the Lake District. So people have been cutting down trees here for many a millennia. They've been digging up land. They've been hefting animals across the area. And we need to recognise that, but recognise what it means for the future. So rather than necessarily talking about the past, what does it mean for the future? So what does farming look like in the Lake District into the future? So we're starting to explore different farming practices that are doing more for nature, but allowing the farmer to be paid for that outcome, delivering more for nature, doing more wildflowers, renaturalising his rivers, but recognising that he or her is changing his farming systems to do that, introducing a different type of grazier. So a lot of our farmers are starting to introduce cattle back into this landscape from farming sheep. And they're really up for it, actually. Most of the farmers recognise that, and they need to adapt. They've been brilliant at it for a couple of thousand years, and we just need to help them through that process. And there's evidence through our landscape of our ability to do this. The third one I just wanted to touch ground on was our experiences, kind of the aftermath of recent storms. There's been this need to come together to kind of understand and share and develop that shared future. So I guess the best example I have is probably up in Keswick, where the people of Keswick loved what was going on, loved the Borrowdale further up the valley, but they weren't that interested in, not that interested, unfair, but weren't engaged that much in the management of that landscape. Keswick was flooded again during the storm Desmond, and it's changed the dynamic between the communities who live in the town and the communities that are managing the land. So people in Keswick are saying, right, what is going on? How are you managing that land? Why is this water arriving in our village in such torrents? And so they're starting to talk to one another, and we're helping to start to facilitate with the National Park and other agencies how those communities talk to each other and help decide what happens here. You know, one of the things is that they need to help to have ownership of those solutions, and we need to think differently about how we work. And it's quite challenging for some of the kind of government organisations to break out of their ways of working, their traditional ways of working, to allow communities to take ownership of some of the solutions that might challenge us and them in the way we work. Well, they are actually, really are challenging this, but in the right way, because we need to recognise that tension between communities and organisations. I think there are other countries in the world where they've kind of given power to the communities to take ownership of it, and I think we need to do more of that in the lakes, and there are pockets of seeing that happening. But what's certainly the case is that we need to connect better what's happening at the top end of the landscape and the top end of the mountains, and what the bottom end of the chain as well, and start to think about how that landscape is managed. We need managed landscapes that are resilient. So this one on the left is Langdale, a beautiful landscape, steeped in tradition, but actually it's quite a, yeah, there we go. So interestingly, if you start to look at this landscape, actually, in terms of a resilient landscape, it's not that resilient, actually. And what do I mean by resilient is that there's not much tree cover here. It's a very bare landscape. So in terms of stopping water coming, if it rains heavily, the water flows off this landscape pretty quickly. You can see the footpaths here, pretty eroded footpaths that act as gullies during high flood. You can see the river system here, further up the valley, is actually a meandering system, but as actually the river has been straightened at this point, and from here, actually out of the picture down here, the river is then straightened again, so which means that the dynamic nature of the river is kind of constrained. And we have kind of remnant evidence of a more wooded landscape. So actually, in terms of a landscape needing to change, this landscape is also protected through World Heritage Site for its field systems. We've got a real debate about how much of this field system are we wanting to lose. So this is also a river up here. You can see how that river through here has been straightened to allow the water to pass through here to protect these fields. But it's really interesting, and so one of the things that's definitely coming forward a lot is this idea of needing to have a more wooded landscape in the Lake District. We have, I think it's about 12% woodland cover, but I think that's one of the things you'll start to see come through. But again, we need to be comfortable that change will take through. But it's this idea of people caring for this landscape and understanding that also is important, because this caring kind of drives a willingness to play their part in looking after it. So there's a very short little film here to talk to you about a project called Fix the Fells. Fix the Fells is a brilliant project where all the partners have come together, recognising that footpath erosion is a big issue that we need to resolve. Let's combine our resources and find a new way of protecting and restoring those footpaths for the users that come here. So I'll just quickly show you that.
It's a team effort, Fix the Fells. Really is a team effort.
It's not unusual for us to walk about an hour and a half into a work site carrying tools.
Certainly carrying the bars is hard work. I find those heavy. The shovels are okay.
Last summer we were up here for 3 days with a host of Fix the Fells volunteers, and we actually built this path. There were 20 tonne of stone in helicopter bags.
This path was quite a remote path, but more and more people are using it, and it's getting more and more eroded.
The Fix the Fells volunteers are a regular group that come out and help us with all sorts of work on the fells, and they help us out with helicopter lists, help us out with marshalling and the like.
Someone on the way up to Coal Pike, so that path there up towards Great Knot.
Got about 1 tonne bags.
There's well over 20 here.
Years ago, all the stone was gathered on the fell by hand, but nowadays we tend to use a helicopter when we can. It prevents us creating new erosion scars where we walk the stone from where we gather it to the job, and it also enables us to gather more sizable stone to build our paths with and our drains, and that makes them better quality and sturdier, and therefore people are more likely to use them.
It's quite addictive. We come out in all weathers, but one of the main reasons you keep coming back is it's just so much fun.
It's a good camaraderie, and they're not a bad bunch of lads, as you can see, you know.
They're a really dedicated bunch, and we couldn't do it without them. Essentially, the nub of the Fix the Fells Partnership's work is the protecting of this iconic landscape. We have 16 million visitors or so a year. They come because of the look of the landscape. We're protecting it and looking after it and preserving it for future generations to enjoy.
So, yeah, at the heart of that is this idea of volunteering and people playing their part. Although it's a very technical task, we're using the resources of the different organisations to help with that. And the volunteers the last year had given over 2,000 days of their time to look after that, and we couldn't manage it without them. So this idea of social pride and being engaged in managing this landscape is something that we're wanting to develop more and more here in the Lake District. One of the other examples just to talk to you about is long-term planning. So we recognise that we need, with the issues of the changing needs from this landscape, the nation requires different things from this landscape moving forward. My principle of kind of the different next chapter of the book, this nation requires it, and if we're going to pay farmers and others to manage this land from the public purse, we need to be really clear about what that is delivering. So we've been working, creating long-term management plans for it, so really identifying the areas where there is greater opportunity to do more for woodland expansion, do more for water, the areas that we want to retain to allow the farms to be productive for their sheep management and stuff like that, but also the areas that we want to protect and make sure we don't lose. So the Lake District is famous for its wood pasture as well, and it's an area that we want to manage. So we've been developing kind of catchment level plans in each valley to start to identify those, engage our farming community in that conversation, engage our communities in that conversation about what do you want this landscape to look like into the future, which are the bits you want to keep, which are the bits you want to engage. What we haven't done yet is work out how to have that conversation with a visitor that kind of drops into this landscape and goes away again. That's the next challenge. But I think, again, this sense of community ownership is going to be really important. Over the last couple of years, we've had quite a turbulent time in terms of different people having different views on this landscape, and we felt it was really important to set out from the National Trust point of view what we think is important. So there's some books for you, some leaflets up there at the end that just gives you a bit more of a flavour for what we think are the challenges that I've talked to you about this evening, how we think we might need to adapt to those challenges and change it, and a series of principles. And we've set out a series of principles that we're going to manage our land through. So recognising that we need to protect the fabric of our land, working with nature, working with a shared purpose with the people that live and work here. Many of these themes I've talked about this evening, but if you want to know more, do pick up a leaflet on the way. We found it was really important for people to understand where we were coming from in the debate. The final couple of slides are kind of, I've talked to you a lot about kind of land management and other bits, but fundamentally, actually, the world goes round because of the economy and money. And so I think World Heritage Site delivers a great opportunity for us to think creatively and differently about the Lake District and how we raise funds for managing this place and allow businesses to flourish using it. So interestingly, when we went and spoke to many other World Heritage Sites in the UK, we asked them kind of what was important to them. Sorry, it's kind of moved around in moving between slides, but the key message is what you get out of World Heritage Site status will depend on what you put in. And so we've got the status now, and we've got the badge. The question for us who are involved in living and working is what we're going to do with it. And so this is the key message. Many places that have made the most of it have really gone for it. And we've got some really great examples out there. And there's two kind of businessy ones, and there's one kind of making more of the natural asset one that I thought I'd just give you a flavour on. The bottom left-hand one is one that's ongoing at the moment. It's a relatively small project, but it kind of much part of a bigger idea of how do we get visitors to pay and pay their part in looking after this landscape. So we've had in the Lake District for the last 15 years a visitor payback scheme where visitors come and when they stay in a hotel or bed and breakfast, they're asked to pay £1 or a contribution on top of their bill towards it, and that money goes to it. It hasn't really worked brilliantly. We've raised a couple $100,000 a year, but no more than that. Given you've got 18 million visitors, it's not unrealistic expectation to say if we had £1 for every visitor that came, it's not a big ask, £1. Actually, £18 million is a big opportunity that we had. So we've recently reformed that work into something called the Lake District Foundation, who has that as its catchphrase. This Lake District Pound idea, which is bubbling up at the moment, has come from people that came on, I think, the IFLAS course, wasn't it? And some members here who I'm sure will be able to talk to you about it. But this idea of actually creating a local currency that works with the local businesses here, and any profits made from that come back into the management of this landscape. It's a really interesting idea. We know that World Heritage Site will allow us to give us a upper hand in the kind of marketing world to international visitors. We already have a lot of Japanese and visitors in particular. We have Americans, German, Europeans, but we know that World Heritage Site, if we work it right, will give us that opportunity again to bring more funds into the Lake District. And then the last one, I guess, is making more natural assets. So it's a hydro scheme. So the trust, we're investing just shy of 12 million into the Lake District at the moment, building a series of hydro schemes that we're looking as a new income stream to fund land management. So I call these the levers. So any business that is successful has a variety of different income streams that allow you to adapt to the different needs. And so we're looking to replace maybe our traditional farmed income and European funding from making more from our natural assets, and hydro being a really good example. And the last one just on here that to give you a flavour is that the National Trust, most of our money comes from our members, and many of our members leave a legacy to us when they die. The Lake District is by far our greatest place that people give money for. And we get about £1 million a year coming into our work in the Lake District from legacies. That just gives you an indication of the people's want and willingness to pay and be part of the story. And part of the story is really important. One of the other challenges that we have is to think about how we create and develop our visitor experience. We know international visitors come with greater expectations. How do we move people around the Lake District? How do we create itineraries that give people a flavour of the special qualities of the Lake District that have been recognised in the World Heritage Site? So we're starting to explore what that looks like, how we develop new tours and things like that to give people a real understanding of the history of this place and what it means today. And a couple of examples of that, for instance, is that Victorians had a series of different ways of going around it, and what we're looking to do is to reimagine some of those Victorian experiences in the modern day. So this is a stone. This is such a British thing, isn't it? It's a stone. So we decided to put a ladder up a stone and turn it into an experience in Victorian times. Interesting, this is called the Boulder Stone. It's in Keswick, and it's an amazing stone. The most interesting thing about that top left-hand picture, it looks like it's in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of fields. You go there now, that's in the middle of a deep, dark woodland, interestingly. Just to give you, and that was 120 years ago. Very different landscape. People think Borrowdale is a wooded landscape. Actually, when the Balderstone was from those photos, it wasn't that wooded at all. So we're reimagining what the experience on the Balderstone looks. And if you go there this next 6 weeks, 2 months, we've got an exhibition about the history of the Balderstone and a conversation with our visitors about let's talk about what we'd like to do on there now. Let's bring people this idea of walking up a stone and getting this view of this amazing landscape from a big stone, like you do. And the second one is Clay Viewing Station. So this, as part of the original Victorian tour, they came up with the idea of viewing stations, places that you would go. You have to take yourself back to the grand Victorian days, that you would come to the Lake District, you would be taken around on steam train and on the ferries, and you'd go to these places and you'd be taken to them and you'd experience the landscape through a different series of senses and experiences, and it'd get you to think differently about those landscapes. It would get you to start to change your perceptions of the world and how you feel about the world. And so it was a really interesting time. And so the example I showed you on the top left of earlier on is the same photo I showed you previously about some of our cultural heritage in disrepair. And we've recently restored this viewing station. It's the last one of the what's called the Thomas West Victorian viewing stations. It's the last one that is in existence. And we've re-established it, put windows back in it to give people a sense of how the Victorians develop that. And so there's this idea that we will develop a series of modern day viewing stations around the Lake District that give our visitors an insight into the landscape and get them to think about it in a different way. So it's exciting times here. I think hopefully you got a sense of some of the challenges we're facing in the Lake District. You get a sense for maybe why the Lake District has been designated a World Heritage Site. And hopefully you get a sense for how we're starting to tackle that, looking through the kind of traditional arms of kind of the social side of life, the economic side of life, and then also the people that live here and work here, and making sure the natural environment is kept in good condition for the future generations. It's definitely an exciting time to live and work here, and I hope you have a flavour of that through what I've talked to you about today. And it's been useful for your experiences, especially our international students, while you're here in the Lake District. So thank you for listening.